So, you are very welcome to Trazyn na Tíre. And tonight we're going to be looking at the 1916 executions with author and historian Derek Molyneux. And we welcome you all who are joining in to listen and participate tonight from Ireland, America, France, and England. And we're not going to let some virus beat us from remembering our great Irish history during this 2020 lockdown. Our historian tonight is the excellent Derek Molyneux, who has co-written with Darren Kelly two of the best books on the 1916 Rising: When the Clock Struck in 1916 and Those of Us Who Must Die. They have both appeared in numerous documentaries I've made with them on my Easter Rising Stories YouTube channel, and we even ran a tour on the Battle of Main Street for a few months. Now, you may have the impression of the 1916 executions being some kind of romantic, Clannad-inspired music montage that you'd see on the TV. It was horrific though in some ways, and that's what we're going to look at. We want to look at warts and all, like what really happened. We'll be looking at unexplored areas of the executions and give a very unique insight into what they would have been like. This talk will take a cold, hard look at the 1916 leaders' poignant final hours and violent deaths. The perspective of those who carried out the executions is also revealed in a gripping, horrific, and moving story of courage in the darkest of moments. So, Derek, you're very, very welcome back to round two of Trazyn na Tíre.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Liam, and thank you to all at Trazyn na Tíre. It's an honour. It's great to be here again. Much appreciated.
Okay, now what we're going to do is I'm just going to start asking you one or two questions. So let's just see. I've been disabled from screen sharing there, Liam. If you can just fix that for me, please. Give me 1 sec. Well, I'll just ask you just while I'm waiting. Derek, what inspired you to write your second book?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. We didn't plan on it. It was only when we finished writing When the Clock Struck. I mean, we wanted initially to write a book about the combat that took place in Dublin, but then having done that, we just kind of decided that we wanted to carry on. We became immersed in the characters that we were studying, and we saw that the stories went right through to 1921 and 23 and even beyond. So it was the logical step, really, was to do a book about the roundups, the executions, and the deportations. I mean, it's an integral part of the story that we wouldn't have been able to fit into When the Clock Struck. And I suppose, I mean, it's an underreported aspect to the story. That was one of the reasons as well. I mean, the executions, you know, they're covered in a lot of biographies, but we couldn't really find much that really, in a similar way to When the Clock Struck, wrenched the reader into the circumstances to kind of experience them as you're going through the story. That didn't really exist, and it was something that we just figured should exist.
Gotcha. Like, one thing I found really interesting was, you know, because the 1916 executions changed like people's mood even. We'll cover that in a minute, but like how it's so important, the executions, to look at in detail. So we'll just start asking you some questions here. Could you describe the process of Patrick Pearse being executed?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you said there, you know, there wasn't, Sinead O'Connor wasn't doing background singing while he was getting led slowly out to an execution to be given a last cigarette and asked if there was any, you know, last words. That did not happen in Kilmainham jail. At 3:45, he was taken from the west wing of the jail, and he was taken. He was taken downstairs. And if watchers are familiar with Kilmainham jail, he was taken on the western side of the jail. There's an entrance to the actual prison building, an exit that leads to the exercise yard, and then you go through another small yard which brings you into the stonebreakers yard. He was blindfolded, as were the rest of them, before they even left the building. Point there, he was taken down the couple of steps that are there, and the word would be he would have been harried. He would have had a couple of soldiers, one link in each arm. And if you picture the yards in Kilmainham, they brought 4 firing squads to carry out 3 executions. They have one in reserve, or else it just could have been an error, but they had 4 there regardless. And the protocols were that a different firing squad executes each prisoner. But Pearse was blindfolded. He wouldn't have seen any of these firing squads, any of these soldiers as he was being led through. And he would have been, like the others, led through, not so much at breakneck speed, but it certainly wouldn't have been a slow sort of a march. And the reason for that is they're trying to take away your cognitive awareness of what's about to happen to you. And this is something that's widely used. We consulted our military advisors on this, and it's what's referred to today as psyops.
Yeah.
It's used particularly when a prisoner is captured, just to keep them disorientated. But just in the scenario of an execution, well, one, the execution firing squads, or the squads, they don't have to make eye contact with the prisoner, nor does the prisoner have to make eye contact with them. But if you're being harried and jostled and turned left and turned right and you can't see, your cognitive awareness most of it is gone. So this was the general idea, and to get them in, to bring them into the Stonebreakers yard, where when they went through the Stonebreakers yard, over to the right-hand side where there's a small crucifix today, there was a wall of sandbags, and Pearse was brought over there and stood in front of the wall of sandbags. He would have been facing left, and he would have been facing a firing squad, which he couldn't see, of 12 men, 6 standing and 6 kneeling. One of the rifles of the 12 would have been loaded with a conscience round, a dummy, a blank. And the idea of this was, as many of the viewers probably already know, is that no member of the firing squad can actually say that they killed the victim, and that's why it's called a conscience round. However, most infantrymen would have known that, because the Lee Enfield rifle that they were using had a particularly strong recoil, which would have been diminished if you were shooting somewhat, if you were using a blank. That's pretty much what he would have faced. And again, the protocols, you would normally associate firing squads with, ready, aim, fire commands. Yeah. That wasn't supposed to happen. But it did happen for the first 3 executions. There was a command of ready and present, and then finally fire. Major Rode, who was in charge of the first executions, he made an absolute pig breakfast of the entire process.
Okay. So like what was meant to happen was like they were meant to come in with a sword, was it? And just like,
not even a sword, an officer's cane.
Okay.
A cane or whatever or they could use a sword as well. The condemned prisoner would be stood with his back to the sandbags, blindfolded, whereupon the officer would, he would, by a series of commands with his sword or a cane, indicate to shoot.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to ask you about Thomas Clarke next. What was the firing squad like during Thomas Clarke's execution?
Well, this is where it gets really, really grisly, because you had Pearse, then you had McDonough, and then you had Clarke. It was it's a heck of a story. I mean, if you picture this, particularly with Clarke, in the West Wing, the 3 men were stood outside their cells. Clarke stood out there. The first execution was 3:45 a.m. when dawn was breaking. The second one, McDonough's, was at 4 a.m. Clarke's was at 4:15. He had to stand outside his cell between 3:45 and 4:15. When his turn came, the soldier who was dealing with him initially, Clarke was brought down the steps, but when it came time to put Clarke's blindfold on, he said he didn't want the blindfold. This struck the soldier. How could it not? This frail-looking man has been stood there for a half an hour listening to 2 of his comrades being shot, and rather than cowering, or begging for mercy, he's looking. I don't want the blindfold. That's what he's saying. But unfortunately for Clarke, he had to wear the blindfold. But he was brought through the same process as Pearse. He would have been harried and jostled into the stand in front of the sandbag wall. But Major Rode, who was in charge of the executions, he had disregarded the fact that there were replacement firing squads there for each prisoner. So he used the same firing squad for Pearse, McDonough and Clarke. And unfortunately for Clarke, whether they were racked with guilt, which is probably the case, none of them could hold their rifle steady. So when the 12 rifles were aimed towards Clarke with 11 bullets, there's a pretty good chance that some of them actually missed altogether, maybe just hit the sandbag wall. But several bullets hit Clarke, but they didn't hit Clarke where they were supposed to hit him, which, like all the prisoners, they would have had a white card pinned to their chest. So with Clarke, they hit anywhere but the white card. So Clarke was pretty much shot to pieces, to the point where a British lieutenant had to run up with his revolver and administer a coup de grace
What does that mean though, like when you're shot to pieces, for people who don't know, what does that mean?
Well, you're looking at, okay, the Lee Enfield, it's a .303 round. It's got a hell of a kick. It was a very accurate rifle and it had a very, very effective range. And had a muzzle velocity of 700 meters per second. That's twice the speed of sound. So if you have several people shooting at you from 10 yards, it's going to make a mess, a horrendous mess.
Okay.
So, I mean, as we describe in the book, Pierce, you know, he was killed instantly. So in a situation like that, you're looking at, you know, 11 bullets converging on an area that's about the size of your fist at twice the speed of sound. Death is going to be instantaneous. But as well as that, one thing that's very rarely covered as well is the fact that the prisoners were shot on ground sheets, on very large canvas ground sheets. So again, in the more poignant and romanticized depictions of executions, you know, you might imagine, you know, two soldiers coming over and lifting the dead person carefully onto the stretcher. That wasn't the case. You were shot on a ground sheet, and I suppose it could be argued that I mean, when they collapsed onto the ground sheet, they were rolled up into the ground sheet and lifted by the ground sheet and put into a nearby shed that was used by the stonebreakers.
Okay.
So Clarke, it didn't end well for Tom Clarke.
Okay. Now, what sparked the changing mood for the general public with these executions?
Well, you know, it is widely acknowledged that you know they had an awful time immediately afterwards. You know, with dogs abuse off a lot of the civilians in Dublin. But as we alluded to, and when the clock struck, that wasn't necessarily the case throughout Dublin. They were applauded and cheered in the Grand Canal Street area. They did have quite a bit of support. And particularly as things went on, there was a sort of a begrudging respect for the fact that they had held out for a week. But nonetheless, there was a huge, you know, vitriolic response from widespread as well, as they were being marched towards Kilmainham Jail in the western parts of the city, where there was an awful lot of Guinness workers who Dublin Fusiliers would have been families, wives of Dublin Fusiliers, as they call them, the Shawleys, the separation women. Were very, very vitriolic, but it kind of came from all over. But what sparked the changing mood, it was, I mean, you could say their demeanour in defeat was obviously a factor. As you mentioned, Marcus, when you launched the book, there was something that struck you. You know, we mentioned it the last lecture as well, the parallel with the bridge on the River Kwai as the four were being marched past the South Dublin Union with their heads held up. The same thing when they were being marched out of Richmond Barracks on the Sunday evening, the same thing, you know, after a week of you know, no sleep, very little food, you know, horrific circumstances, the demoralisation of surrender, and then they're being marched off to Northwall Quay. Again, they're holding their heads up and they're singing as they're being brought through the city. The executions, that's widely acknowledged as, you know, the fulcrum around which, you know, the change in sentiment actually swung. You know, particularly the fact that they were so drawn out.
Yeah.
Had they done them all in a day or two, it would have been done. But you know, the fact that they, you know, they did it for over a 12-day period can't have helped. Reports of British atrocities, although the British themselves weren't going around and shouting out the fact of what the South Staffordshires had done in North King Street, or what Bowen Coulthard, of course, had done. That's just two examples of what went on. But you know, word was getting around the city at this stage again that you know, all was not necessarily as they were being told. Another one as well, the priests, the reports from the Capuchin monks of the stoicism of the leaders as they were being executed. Like, as we mentioned in the book as well, after the first three executions, when Pierce, McDonagh and Clarke were brought up to the back of Arbour Hill prison to be buried, there was a priest there who was there to perform a ceremony while they were being interred. He put his hand on one of the bodies that was still warm, but he noticed that the two soldiers that brought them up were quite forlorn. They were struck by the fortitude, and they actually acknowledged to the priest. They said that they died well. They died like soldiers. So this was something so there was a combination of all these things.
From your research, like, do you think it was like premeditated, like we know how this is going to be recorded? I know it's a very subjective question, but like, you know, we know how this is going to be recorded. If we show fear, this will be bad in terms of the whole movement, public relations, or is it just naturally the way they were, do you think? Or
in terms of the actual condemned men, or
yeah, it's a tough question, I know, but
I would say it's a very good question, Marcus, because, you know, there comes a time, as any you know, lifelong student of combat and warfare will say, there comes a time when you reach a threshold when you break.
Yeah,
they didn't reach it, regardless of you know, what they might have thought. What your cognitive mind tells you will be a great thing, you know, before things actually kick off and before you're in the situation, and how your mind reacts in that situation are often two very, very, you know, different things.
Okay.
So I think it would be hard to say that they acted strategically. You know, although, you know, it could also be argued as well, but I mean, you can't take away from the fact that they were incredibly brave individuals and very, very committed individuals.
Yeah. Which brings us on nicely to the next question. John McBride, was John McBride accepting of the executions?
He didn't expect to survive. He's a very interesting character, McBride. When he turned up, you know, more or less accidentally, you know, to spend Easter week in Jacob's biscuit factory, he really galvanized the garrison, you know, because he was a bit of a legend, you know, because of all the exploits in the Second Boer War. When they were surrendering in Jacob's, he had an opportunity to escape, and the volunteers actually said to him, "Listen, why don't you leg it? You know, nobody will know you were here." McBride basically said, he said, "Look, you know, the G-men in Dublin, the you know, the political police, they knew who he was, and they probably wouldn't be long in finding out, you know, that he had been there." So he decided to go to throw in his lot with the surrendered rebels. But he said on a couple of occasions, at least one that we documented in the book as well, that he wasn't going to get out of there, that they knew who he was, and that they'd kind of been, you know, anticipating any kind of a chance to get him because of his antics in the Boer War, that they would. Now, I know me and you spoke there a couple of weeks ago. We were wondering, was that a contributory factor in his execution? I debate that fact. It's very interesting as well, because General Blackadder, who conducted McBride's court-martial, afterwards, when he was in the officers' mess, he was asked, you know, has any of these guys actually really stood out to you? And he said, yeah, the one who did was McBride. He basically, I'll actually have a little extract here, which I think is probably, it won't take long. He described McBride in the court-martial. "He, on entering, stood to attention, facing us, and in his eyes I could read, 'You are soldiers, I am one. You have won, I have lost. Do your worst.' He then spoke of the Boer War, during which he had thought of McBride as about the lowest thing that had crawled. Now confessed, 'I will never think of him now without taking my hat off to a brave man.'" So he's a very, very interesting character. And even his conduct in Richmond Barracks, the sort of, you know, the galvanizing effect that he had on the rest of the prisoners. And then, of course, the way he like Tom Clarke, faced his own execution, asking not to be blindfolded.
Yeah.
But yes, I think to answer the original question, he suspected very, very strongly that he wasn't going to be getting out of there alive.
Yeah, he knew beforehand. Yeah, absolutely. Ned Daly, though, he'd seen the bodies from the night before his execution.
You kind of wonder when you get stories like this, why haven't Netflix got a hold of this?
I know.
Or somebody like that, because it really, really is, it's stirring stuff just in terms of the storytelling.
Yeah.
Daly on the third, on the morning of the third, he had asked, I think it was Fraser, the officer in charge in Richmond Barracks. I think it was Colonel Fraser. He'd actually asked him, could he see Tom Clarke before he was executed? And Fraser, he actually agreed. So he sent Ned Daly with a very, very strong guard, a guard of 12 men from Richmond Barracks at probably about 3 o'clock, 3:30 in the morning, to walk down to Kilmainham jail. And when he got there, Major Lennon, he was a Dublin Fusiliers officer, and he was in command in the prison. Daly, they relayed the message that Daly wanted to see Tom Clarke, and Lennon said, "Look, you can't. he's about to be shot. You can't go in and see him. So Daly, very, very pluckily sort of asked, he said, well, can I see him, can I go and see him afterwards? So that was agreed to. So Daly was brought in, stood in a room until the executions were finished, or until Clarke's execution was finished. I think he was led down there. I think he heard Pearce's execution on the way. I think he was there for McDonough's. But when the 3 executions were done, he was eventually brought out into the Stonebreakers' yard and directed over to the shed where the 3 bodies had now been put.
Yeah.
He went over and he took his cap off, knelt down beside Tom Clarke's body, said a prayer for him, stood up, put his officer's cap back on, and stood up straight and saluted. Daly was standing in the same Stonebreakers' yard that he would have to come back to within 24 hours for his own execution. It's,
And Daly, for those who don't know, is related to Tom Clarke. There's the
yeah.
Okay. So one thing though, this is a question that I'm going to ask you I really do want your opinion on this, because I find it very interesting. From the British point of view, why on earth did the British let Joe Plunkett marry Grace Gifford? Because surely they would have known that something like this, a marriage in a jail, would be seen, like in terms of public relations, as a disaster for them. What do you think about that?
Well, on the one hand, you could say that the British at the time didn't do public relations. That's why you had the executions going on, being conducted the way they were. And when you bring it on to the War of Independence and some of the stuff that was going on, you kind of see that they didn't really have much of a grasp of. It could be argued that they didn't have much of a grasp on public relations. They were consistently outmaneuvered by Republican propaganda in the War of Independence. But having said that, they were acutely aware of the power of propaganda. And that's why Countess Markievicz wasn't shot, because they were aware of the worldwide reaction to the Germans having executed Edith Cavell in Belgium in 1914. Okay. So they were aware of propaganda. In relation to this, it's a tricky one to grapple with, but it could be said, Marcus, that the British officer corps saw themselves, it was kind of ingrained in them to be gentlemanly, to be chivalrous. That could have been a part of it. It wasn't something that was just kind of a decision that was made on the spot. She went to Colonel Owens, who was in charge of Richmond Barracks, and he told her to come back, that he'd have to refer this request up the chain of command. So it went to the very, very highest echelons before it was allowed. If you were a cynic, you could say that, again, the British being aware as they were of propaganda and anticipating the backlash, they might have seen it as an opportunity to show that they weren't, that they were decent.
But it's not seen that way afterwards.
I think it's one that's it's impossible to kind of give an answer that isn't conjecture.
No, but it's easy. Like they don't have the benefit of hindsight, in terms of how this is going to be seen. So maybe, it turns out it wasn't that way, but maybe they thought that, this might be seen as being humane. Yeah, it's an interesting point.
Or equally, it could have been a case that, when the call was made, you could have had a stiff upper lip British officer just kind of going, yeah, whatever, without giving it a second thought.
Yeah, okay. The Prime Minister of England comes over. How was he in terms of why and when did he come over? What was the reason for it?
Herbert Asquith.
That's a picture of him there. Yeah.
Well, he turned up at Richmond Barracks on the 12th of May, and this was something that really, really struck Darren and myself when we were working on the book. He came over to see General Maxwell. Obviously, he was the Prime Minister. Maxwell was the guy in charge. Dublin had been through this, monumental event. But you look at it in the wider context and how it was appreciated by the volunteers as something of a very, very significant Freudian slip made by the British Prime Minister. When he went to Richmond Barracks, as you can imagine, in any military barracks, when the Prime Minister is coming for a visit, you're going to have the officers and the NCOs are going to be shouting around to make sure that everybody's got their boots and their buttons polished, and you're going to on you know, your best parade formation that you can get together. This is what they did. However, when Asquith got into Richmond Barracks, the first people he wanted to see were the volunteers. Now, this sent a resounding message, not only to the volunteers, but also to the British military. Now, the way we describe this in the book, it's on the morning of the 12th of May. James Connolly and Sean McDermott have been executed, and you've got this emotional roller coaster that's going on before that, because there's a sense of will they, won't they, because, you know, the word was out now that they were calling off the executions, and then suddenly for them to lose Connolly, who they loved, and McDermott, who they loved as well, this was a shattering blow to the volunteers. So on that particular day, you've got this, you know, really, really, you know, I don't know what the word would be, crestfallen atmosphere in Richmond Barracks. But when the volunteers then are queuing up for the breakfast that they've been having, the ones that haven't been deported at this point are queuing up to get their breakfast. You can imagine they're getting pretty meager rations. But some soldiers, they're getting dog biscuits, you know, there's nothing very nice, a bit of dry bread or whatever. However, on the morning of the 12th, that's why we named the chapter that deals with that. Jesus, lads, we're in the Gresham, because that's what one of the volunteers said to Liam Tanham while they were queuing up to get their breakfast, because they're getting hot porridge, they're getting, you know, milk, they're getting sweet tea, they're getting bread and jam, they're getting, you know, bits of meat even. While the soldiers in the barracks on the morning that the Prime Minister is due to call aren't getting anything of the kind. The volunteers thought this was great, because they were able to rub some of the soldiers' noses in it, because some of the soldiers had been particularly cruel to the volunteers, whereas some of the other soldiers had done their best to help them. So they were getting repaid in kind. They were sharing their nice breakfasts with them. So something was going on as far as they were concerned, which did kind of alleviate the pain, the anguish of Connolly and McDermott, you know, combined with all the other executions, plus the fact that a lot of their comrades were gone and they didn't know where they were. So, you know, these guys are rudderless at this point in this, you know, horrific, you know, sort of a scenario. And then up turns the British Prime Minister. When they saw him and he came to inspect them, a lot of them would have been wearing the old caps, the forage caps. They got taken, thrown in the air, because they saw it as a victory. It could be said that... You
mean the volunteers were throwing the hats in the air?
They were thrown like they were students, you know, or police on a passing out parade. You could say that was their passing out parade, effectively, because it indicated to them that they had lost the battle, but there was a war to be won.
And, like, why were the executions so drawn out? Like, what was the reason for it? I mean, like, was Asquith over because you could see public opinion changing?
He was over because, yeah, there was a huge backlash. It was immediately visible. There was debates going on in the House of Commons. You had John Dillon who was making some fantastic. He was with the Irish Parliamentary Party, making some fantastic speeches, going like, "What? You can't be doing this. You know, you're the British Empire. You're talking about going to war for small nations. You know, you label yourself as not the all-conquering empire. You're seen as a liberal, benevolent influence in the world, and yet, you know, you've got this." You know, army here, the Irish volunteers, who came out, you know, some of them in uniform, but they declared war. They stood outside the GPO and declared their intentions. They fought you in open battle, and now you're taking out their officers and you're shooting them.
Yeah, yeah.
If this was the Germans doing this, you know, you'd be telling the whole world about it. So you had this going on. You had an awful lot of political turmoil going on. Plus, you also had questions being raised about the massacre in North King Street. So I think Asquith, you know, he'd been, you know, front and centre in the whole Home Rule debacle of the previous few years as well. And with the rising kind of it kind of, you could say it bludgeoned the whole Home Rule process back onto their agenda. It had been part of September 1914 for the First World War. And as far as British politicians were concerned, that's grand. We'll get to that when the war is finished. But when the rising took place, you know, it was a serious wake-up call for Asquith, and that's you know, a combination of those reasons is what brought him over.
Okay. How were the family members of the volunteers treated?
They were actually treated very well. That's the only way to put it. They were treated a lot better by the British than the families of the executed irregulars were treated, for example, during the Civil War.
Yeah.
Visits
They
were
weren't lay priests in the Civil War, I think, were they? Or
well. I mean, you had situations where condemned men were shot before the families were even told.
yeah. Okay.
And again, the British were always very, very sort of, very proud of the sense of decency that they extolled.
Okay.
So visits were facilitated. Has to be said, some of the lower ranks were very, very insulting to family members. I think it was Michael O'Hanrahan's sister nearly collapsed when I think it was a British sergeant. I think he was an Irish sergeant in a British uniform. Said something very, very derogatory to her, and that was kind of the core. It was nearly sent her. She had as much as she could take, pretty much at that point. But in the main, they went to great pains to find relatives and loved ones. Kathleen Clarke, they didn't know where any of them lived, so they got the DMP, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, there from the police station in Kilmainham to get into cars with soldiers and show them around the city. They brought Kathleen Clarke. They went to great pains to get Kathleen Clarke. Grace Gifford, they went to great pains to get her there as well. When she, after the wedding was finished, she was now Grace Plunkett. She left Kilmainham jail. But when they went looking for her, they didn't know where she was. So they actually sent a car up to her family's address up in Palmerstown Road. And when the officer called, he asked, looking for Grace Plunkett. So the family thought, you must be looking for somebody else. There's no Grace Plunkett living here, because they didn't know that she had been married. But nonetheless, they persevered and got her in there. The same thing with Thomas McDonough, with his wife. They sent a car up to collect her in Ranelagh, where she lived, but the car couldn't get there because, although the rising was finished, there was still fighting going on, and there was a skirmish going on in Ranelagh as they were making their way there. Look at Michael O'Hanrahan. They sent a car up to collect his family members, and when the soldier who was in charge of that saw a few nosy neighbours tweaking their curtains to get a look, and he took great offence to that and basically told them, if you don't get away from the windows, I'll get my men to shoot you. When William Pearce was being executed, they fetched his mother and his sister. Their car broke down in Terranure on the way in from Rathfarnham. The British driver and his assistant or whatever, they went to great pains to get the car fixed, and they did. They got it fixed in time to get them in there to see Willie before he was shot. So overall, they went to great pains. But it has to be said as well that the soldiers themselves were very, very moved by the interactions, by the family interactions, and by the volunteers. This was something that really, really rings true as the story progresses. It comes to, there's one of the nights there towards the end in Kilmainham jail where we paint a picture in the book of if you imagine the landings in Kilmainham jail or whatever, it's going to be a very, very quiet, very, very subdued sort of atmosphere. People talking quietly in whispers, but there's a sense that the British soldiers, when they hear that the executions are about to stop, when they hear this erroneously because they weren't, but they were going around and more or less nodding at these guys. In some instances where you had prisoners who had been condemned to death, but then they found out in their cells afterwards that your sentence has now been commuted to life imprisonment. Some of the soldiers were grabbing the guys by the arms and saying, listen, mate, well done. Glad to hear that you're not going to be shot. Some of them were going out of their way to make sure that they had cigarettes and stuff like that. But overall, has to be said, the family members were treated very well.
This is very different treatment to maybe a few days before, ran by the Rotunda, when they're being humiliated.
With Lee Wilson.
Yeah, why do you think there was the change? Was it different contingents of British troops, or what was the reason, do you think, for the change in manner?
Well, Lee Wilson was drunk. That's for starters. He'd been in a pub for several hours. In every army, regardless, you're going to have officers who are just not worth the salt. I mean, some of his own troops were horrified the way he was carrying on.
Yeah.
It has to be said as well. In Kilmainham jail on the Sunday when some of the volunteers were brought in there as well, they were treated dreadfully. I think I think Michael Staines was saying that they were brought into one of the cells where there was blood splats on the walls from prisoners being beaten and things like that. But I think largely they were the exception. I'm sure there was an awful lot of British officers that would have been more or less indifferent. Bear in mind, particularly the officers would have had experience of the First World War that was going on. You know, they were there was monumental battles with, you know, tens of thousands of casualties happening. So for a lot of them, they would have looked at this as, it wasn't, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't really, you know, noteworthy.
Okay. On television, an awful lot, and because I make films, I'm very conscious of this. You're given the impression that they were all standing. Now, some were standing, like Tom Clarke and that, but some of the volunteers were seated. Can you explain?
Yeah, on the 8th of May, it was Eamon Kant, it was Sean Houston, Michael Mallon and Con Colbert. They were put sitting on, I suppose you'd call them a soapbox, or a large sort of a box that back in those days you would have chipped tea in, or, you know, just a big wooden box. Now, the only reason I can surmise from this is to help the soldiers aim. If they didn't tie these guys to posts to keep them still, if you look at some of the World War II executions, for example, that's what you'll see. That didn't happen. So if you have, you know, somebody who's exhausted, terrified, you know, as I mentioned earlier on, having been jostled into the stonebreaker's yard with a soldier on each arm, you probably won't be able to stand very still. I think that the boxes to sit on, they would have helped that situation. I mean, when Kant was sat, Kant was particularly tall, and when they sat him, they spread both of his legs apart to make sure that he was in a steady position. So I can only assume that that's why they did it. It didn't work.
Why?
Well, Kant was shot to pieces. Kant suffered a worse death than even Tom Clarke.
Can you mention how? Or
they just missed. They pinned on the white card target. He was the first to be executed that morning, so it wasn't a case of, you know, it could have been that the soldiers, for all we know, they could have been racked with guilt, and we do allude to that in the book. These firing squads were far from the bloodthirsty, vengeance-fueled, you know, devils that, you know, folklore has sometimes conveyed them to be. That's not the case at all. They couldn't get soldiers to take part in the firing squads. They were sending sergeants into the Sherwood Foresters who made up the firing squads, saying to them, look what these guys did to you at Mount Street, Northumberland Road. Although it was a different company of the Sherwood Foresters that they were using, but nonetheless they were saying, look at what they did to you, you know, in the likes of the South Dublin Union and elsewhere. And moreover, look at what they did to your sister battalions down in Mount Street and Northumberland Road. They could not get volunteers to do it. They would have had fellas who would have been up for misdemeanors, maybe drunk on duty or absent from duty. Sergeants were saying to them, look, you know, we'll disregard that if you, and then they were even offering them money, and they couldn't get them to do it. So it got to the point where they had to just pick men to do it. They did not want to be there. Now, I'm sure there was exceptions to that. And on the morning of Kant's execution, it was that morning that it was Captain Dixon who recorded that one of his men had actually asked, could they use bayonets, that he didn't want to waste a bullet or have to clean his rifle after shooting these rebels. He preferred stabbing them. Now, that's, again, similar to Lee Wilson. That's you know...
He preferred to stab them.
Yeah, you know, he's probably not a very, very nice individual. On the other hand, these are soldiers. So you're going to have an awful lot of barrack room sort of talk. You're going to, you know, dressing room stuff that you're going to have before the match. Let's kill them. Yeah. That's the way people talking in situations like that. Nonetheless, Captain Dixon, he recorded that, he said that. So it's possible, you know, it's debatable. There could have been, you know, this could have been a firing squad that wanted Kant to suffer. They could have known who he was, that he was in command at the South Dublin Union. That was where the 2/6, that's where they, you know, probably had their worst experience of the fight. And so you know, that's open for argument.
Okay.
But the point remains, they missed the white card, and so Kant had to have a coup de grace as well. But he was heard groaning in agony. Clarke wasn't. Clarke was silent. He would have been twitching, but Kant was actually heard groaning. Now, in the subsequent 3 executions, they were killed instantly. They were all shot through the heart.
Okay. Michael Mallon, can you tell me about Michael Mallon's execution and his last meeting with his family? I I'm one of the people who are kind of lucky that I've got the last video recording with his son, his 104-year-old son, Father Joseph Mallon. He only died there recently. But can you tell me what happened during his execution?
Well, his execution itself, it was one of the less gruesome ones. But the night before, it was particularly moving to describe Mallon's experience with his family. He was the only one, as far as I can remember, whose kids were brought in. And we depict at one stage, there's two boys, I think they were 10 and 12, they had to wait outside in the main prison concourse, where, if you imagine, all the prisoners were on the ground floor at that point, the condemned. And these two boys had to wait outside in the concourse for their turn to see their dad, because the mother was in there. I think there was a baby in there as well. I know Michael Mallon's brother was in there as well. But they had to wait their turn. And you can just imagine how awful it must have been for them to have to walk past these other cells. And while they're sitting there, they can see candles flickering from the cells. They can hear subdued conversations. They can hear prayers being muttered. And then eventually they had to go in and spend their last moments with their dad. The first thing that Michael Mallon said to them was, he broke down with grief and saying, I'm to be killed in the morning. Mallon's wife, he was in a cell next door to Sean Houston, and there was a priest in with Sean Houston at the time, and they were being guarded by a soldier. But when the priest heard the cries and sobs of Michael Mallon's wife, he thought something was wrong. So he asked the soldier, could he go in next door? And the soldier said, no, you can't. Certainly not. That's a breach of protocol. I can't let you do that. But when the crying continued and it was so loud, the soldier yielded and he said, look, you better go in there. Some of the things that Mallon said on the night before, his brother asked him, have you any regrets? And he came out with some, he said something along the lines of, Ireland is a grand country, but the people that are in it are rotters.
Yeah.
And then he also said that the first Irishman to join the British Army was a bastard. It's interesting because he was also...
He was in the British Army himself.
Yeah. But, this is a situation where he's under incredible stress. But yeah. With all this going on. But I think with particular regard to Mallon, it's he knew his wife and kids were facing destitution. And that turned out to be the case.
Is that why there's the controversy with him and Countess Markievicz?
There is it's often said that he tried to hang Countess Markievicz, and again we introduce another aspect to that in the book. Countess Markievicz was court-martialed before Michael Mallon.
Okay.
Bear this in mind. When it was discovered by the volunteers that they weren't effectively being given a fair trial, they were being tried by court-martial and they weren't being afforded defence counsels. At that stage, the gloves sort of came off. They were ordered to do whatever you could to get off. That's simply put. There was an acknowledgement that this is only the first round in a fight. If you can survive this, do. So when Mallon went into his court-martial, he would have went in there with the knowledge that these were orders. Now, he knew that Countess Markievicz had been court-martialed the previous day. Everybody suspected quite strongly that Countess Markievicz was not going to be shot because she was a woman. But regardless, the fact that her court-martial had concluded, there's nothing that he could have said about Markievicz that would have made it any worse for her. She was processed.
Isn't there conflicting reports about Countess Markievicz's trial?
There are. William Wiley, the prosecutor, it's a very, very interesting character. William Wiley was a moderate unionist. He was a British Army lieutenant at the time. He didn't want to be a prosecutor. And he certainly didn't want to be a prosecutor when he saw what was actually happening and that the Republicans weren't being given a proper defence. There's a couple of situations. I mean, for example, he tried to help Eamon Kant during his court-martial by just getting kind of subtle hints across, listen, this is what you might want to say here. Not quite doing it that way, but effectively that's what he was doing. He recorded, now it was decades later, that Countess Markievicz had begged for her life. Please don't shoot me. Don't you know I'm a woman? However, Darren did exhaustive research into this. And one thing that Darren picked up on was that the court-martial officers who were there, they wrote everything down. The British were meticulous about one thing, it was paperwork. If something was said during those court-martials, it was written down. And nowhere is it written that Countess Markievicz begged for her life. Moreover, if she had, we mentioned about propaganda, what sort of a propaganda boost would that have been for the British at the time? To say that this defiant woman had actually begged for her life. It wasn't. Markievicz was a thorn in the side of the British authorities for many, many years after the Rising. And not once was that used against her. So I don't understand why he did it, because he chose his side, and the same way he did in the War of Independence, but he played by the rules.
That's a great point, though. Because she was seen as a real thorn in their side after 1916. Why they didn't make more of that during the War of Independence about her if they were looking to attack her, the British, that's a very, very interesting point. I just want to ask you about the Capuchin monks. How were the Capuchin monks with the prisoners? You hear Con Colbert and Sean Houston, by the way. Yeah.
Well, they would have been pivotal. The likes of Con Colbert, some of them were very, very religious. Some of them weren't. But just the fact that they had these, this spiritual sort of, somebody to refer to in your final hours. And the Capuchin monks, I think, were quite, I wouldn't say radical, but I think they would have been one of the less conservative orders. You can see what they do now up in Dublin. That they're in the vanguard in the fight against poverty at the minute. There's nothing to suggest that they weren't back then. Possibly very forward thinking in terms of their outlook compared with some of the clerical organisations. But to answer the question, absolutely pivotal. They provided tremendous solace. But even more so, as I mentioned earlier on, it's not so much how they were with the prisoners, it's how effective they were in conveying the demeanour of the prisoners, which they in no small part would have helped to bolster. But it was the Capuchin monks were instrumental in getting word outside, about the reports of how these guys were going to their executions like lions. And that would have been a huge component in the change of sentiment towards them.
Okay. In terms of Sean McDermott, did Sean McDermott think he'd get away with being executed?
Again, he's fascinating to study in this regard. There's early on when they're in Richmond barracks, there's one stage when they've been led across to the latrines, and one of his fellow volunteers grabs him because he was lame. He had polio, and he walked with a limp since. And I think it was Lee Wilson had taken his walking cane off him, and immediately after the Rising. But so when they're walking over towards the latrines together, the other volunteer, so what do you reckon is going to happen? They're having a conversation, and McDermott turned around and said, more or less, I'm going to be shot, and it's a damn good thing that I will be shot. And he said it on more than one occasion. That's the best thing that could happen for Ireland if they were shot, because he was an incredibly astute individual. He was the brains behind the IRB at the time, and the Rising along with Tom Clarke. He understood fully the propaganda implications of any executions that were taking place and would take place. Having said that, opportunities arose for him to escape, and he tried to avail of them. There was a couple of lineups where prisoners were being deported, and at least one stage he had a chance to get himself stood among volunteers who were being deported, until I think it was Detective Hoey and Detective Barton came along, and it was Barton that actually wrenched Sean McDermott out of the line and very, very cruelly said, "We know who you are, and there's going to be 6 for you in the morning," referring to bullets. How they got him in the end was very interesting as well. When he was being processed in Richmond Barracks, they went through his pockets and they found a mobilisation order. They found quite a few of them, but they were signed Sean McDermott, but he signed his name John McDermott. So they couldn't, this wasn't proof enough for them just to shoot him because of that. So they had to explore other avenues, and one of those avenues was, they were conducting raids all over the city. They were finding, bundles of mobilisation orders. They were interrogating people, but nothing was happening. But until there was somebody up in Mountjoy Prison. Edward Gannon was his name. He was a clerk up in Mountjoy Prison, where Sean McDermott had been incarcerated there the previous year. And when you're in prison, when you're getting brought in, they take your cash off you, whatever belongings that you have, and then they give them back to you on the way out. But he signed for them, Sean McDermott, on the way out. That's what got him. And it was Detective Hoey who was really, he was going after him during the court martial and practically licking his lips when he saw that McDermott had been caught. I mean,
so what about then the link then with Hoey being shot later in the War of Independence and Michael Collins link?
Well, no.
Or not?
I don't think that they would have considered it unpleasant to have done, you know, I think it would have been for them not a disagreeable side effect, but the reason why he was shot was because he was still very aggressively going after the volunteers. He got a raid on number 6 Harcourt Street that morning, and word had come in to the fledgling squad that I think it was Mick MacDonald who said they're after the man we want to guard, which at that time was Collins. Interestingly as well, Barton was next to be shot after Hoey.
And you also have Lee Wilson as well, you see. That's why I'm asking.
Well, you'll have to wait till the next book, because we
we
reveal why Lee Wilson was shot, and it wasn't to do with what was going on in the rotunda. Although, again, Liam Tobin, who was one of those who took part in Lee Wilson's shooting, he had swore in the grounds of the rotunda that one day he was going to get him.
Yeah.
And he did.
Okay. Let's look at James Connolly next. Now, one thing about James Connolly, everybody knows he was injured, but then he was on morphine. And I was wondering, was he even conscious during his execution? If you are on morphine, do you even know what's going on?
There was a Dr. Tobin who was looking after Connolly, and just referring back to Kant's execution, there was a Captain Stanley from the Royal Army Medical Corps who was dealing with the prisoners up until that point. When he saw Kant being executed and getting the coup de grace, he stormed off. He basically said, I'm not doing this anymore. He'd had enough. So there was a Dr. Tobin who was in charge of Connolly. And I mean, the descriptions in the book of Connolly's last day in Dublin Castle are moving. They're intensely moving. Connolly was a former British soldier. He had the common touch. That's well documented, and he was very good at, putting it simply, having the crack with soldiers who were guarding. So they were exchanging stories, soldier stories with him. He would have been talking when he was a young fella, in the army. They would have been recounting their experiences to him about being, fighting in the war or whatever, or just their general misadventures in the military. Everybody pretty much took a shine to Connolly. When he was being stretchered out, you had a cordon of nurses on the staircase there in Dublin Castle, bawling their eyes out. You had a cordon of soldiers in battle dress. He was given a dose of morphine by Dr. Tobin, but Dr. Tobin knew how much to give him. He would have looked at Connolly's build and things like that, but he gave him just enough to dull the pain, but not to knock him out, that they needed him conscious. So, I mean, Connolly was asked when he was getting into the wagon that was going to bring him down to Kilmainham jail, would he forgive the men who were to shoot him? And Connolly basically, famously said, I'd forgive any man who does his duty according to his lights. He knew it wasn't personal. When he was brought in, well, having said that, now he'd only just been given the morphine at this point, but when we got down to Kilmainham jail, the morphine had definitely kicked in. So he was very groggy, but he was still conscious. When he was put in the chair to be shot, he put his hands around his back and he grabbed the hold of the rungs.
So he wasn't tied to the chair then, like some accounts have said?
Not according to what we saw. We didn't know. We have him sat in the chair, and again, that tying somebody to a chair takes time. This was done mechanically, quickly. There was the officer who was in charge of the firing squad. Again, it's part of the very moving account of his execution. He saw Connolly in the chair and he pulled one of the sharpshooters over from the firing squad, somebody who he knew was a good shot, and he ordered him to aim for the head. And he said to him, that man has suffered enough. You could clearly see that. So Connolly was shot through the heart and he was shot through the head, but it wasn't out of cruelty. And then There was Dr. Tobin, who turned around and looked at Connolly when he was on the ground in the Stonebreakers yard. Connolly was shot down the opposite end of the Stonebreakers yard. There's a wooden gate that you could kind of you'd fit a carriage in. He was literally brought in through that gate and taken out and put into the chair and shot. But Dr. Tobin, he acknowledged that Connolly was one of the bravest men he'd ever met just after they'd shot him.
Okay. One of the things that I find interesting about the executions is who wasn't executed. And you probably find this on your Facebook page on Dublin 16 then and now. And I find on Easter Rising Stories that once you put up about De Valera, people are going, oh, well, you know, it's because he was American that he was let off. But that wasn't the case at all, was it?
No, sure. He was a British spy, don't you know?
No, but go on. By the
De Valera
way,
wasn't executed. De Valera wasn't executed because of timing.
Yeah.
At that stage, like he was next on the list with among others, and at that time, Maxwell had been speaking. Well, I think it was Lieutenant Wiley, and they just concluded just before Connolly and McDermott were shot that they had to knock this on the head. Yeah. And De Valera's name was brought up, and Wiley turned around and said, "Look, he's only a schoolmaster. He's harmless." That's what got De Valera off.
You know the way though that like Elizabeth O'Farrell was kind of slow to get him convinced to surrender. Do you think that would have contributed to him not being executed, or
the fact? No, not the time that they surrendered. More so the fact of where they were brought. They were brought down to the RDS. So they didn't get to Richmond, whereas the first of the volunteers were brought up to Richmond Barracks on Sunday the 30th of April.
Okay.
De Valera and his men didn't get there until the 2nd of May, on the Tuesday. And I think that, if I remember rightly, that was late in the afternoon. At that stage, the court martials were already going on.
Okay. And the treatment of the men in Frongok, what was that like? Were they being treated fairly, like, or did the attitudes change when they went to any internment camp?
Well, I'll go back to I'll come back if we've time, because just when you're talking about who they had in their clutches that they led away. I mean, you're looking at like Thomas Ashe, for example. He was court-martialed. You know, that they would have done well to shoot some of them. You know, had they known how influential that they were going to be afterwards. Frank Thornton was court-martialed. Harry Boland, Liam Tobin, who you have there in the photograph. You look at Liam Tobin. He was Michael Collins' deputy director of intelligence. Frank Thornton was Tobin's second in command after Tom Cullen. So you know, it's not just Dev. You know, you had all these guys who really came back to come at the British again, hugely effectively. I mean, like Tobin. I know Michael Collins rightly gets, you know, most if not all of the credit for the intelligence war in Dublin, but I mean, Collins to me strikes me as, you know, he was the CEO. He was approving more or less Liam Tobin's instructions. Tobin and Thornton, Tom Cullen, and the other intelligence guys, they were doing most of the work. They were gathering and collating the information at massive risk to themselves and giving this to Collins, whereupon Collins would have to bring, you know, if they wanted to shoot somebody because, you know, they were a danger to the movement, Collins didn't just turn around and say, okay, well, that's grand, you can shoot him. He had to go to Cattle Brewer. He had to go to the IRA Army Council to get approval for this. But that's just Tobin. Tobin strikes me as a really fascinating character. Very sort of a quiet individual. You can see him there in the photograph. He's a very lean looking, very unassuming sort of a fella. He was lethal when it came to the War of Independence. Again, same thing with Frank Thornton. Frank Thornton's escapades when he was sent over to the prisons in England they're absolutely spellbinding. Among the likes of Gerald Doyle as well. The misadventures of these guys in Dartmoor prison.
And Harry Boland as well. Yeah.
Harry Boland in Dartmoor prison. It just is absolutely relentless thorn in the side of the prison authorities to the extent that the governor actually came to, I wouldn't say like him, but I think he became very entertained by him.
Could you give one example of something he would have done?
Well, he just wouldn't keep quiet.
Yeah.
They were under orders to maintain silence, and Boland was just, I don't think Harry Boland did silence. I feel like myself and yourself, Marcus.
Thanks.
There's so many accounts of what these guys witnessed. And again, you mentioned at the start of the interview why we wanted to write this book. The stories are incredible. You had prisoners down in Portland prison. They were being treated dreadfully. They were being given sod all to eat. They're in these freezing cold cells. They haven't even got shoelaces for their shoes. A lot of them are on suicide watch because conditions are so bad. They're struggling, grappling with their own sanity, trying to get through the day. And I mean, Gerald Doyle gives a great account of one of his more interesting episodes was when the naval guns at Portland, which was a huge port, they were trying to shoot a German submarine that had snuck in towards the harbour. He thought this was great, a bit of entertainment. You didn't have Netflix, obviously. And he's just hearing the entire prison is shaking because of these huge naval guns that are shooting out to sea. You had other incidences like where the Australian prisoners, when they were being moved, not the Australian prisoners, the Australian guards, when they were being moved from Portland to Pentonville in 1917, the Australians are singing and cheering for the Irish. But what happens when they get up to London? They arrive in Waterloo Station and there's a Zeppelin raid, there's an air raid going on. So there's bombs going off when they get to London. But what happens? Things get worse because the Londoners find out who they are. They start picking up rubble from the bombing raid and start chucking it all at the IRA men, who start throwing it back. There's so many of these amazing stories. You talk about Frongok there and how they were treated. I mean, before I go to Frongok, I'll talk about Stafford and Wakefield.
Yeah.
I mean, horrendous conditions. You had, I think, Robert Holland, one of the chapter names we call, I could wipe my nose with the skin of my belly. That's how he described it, because they were so hungry. He recounts in his witness statement where every time he got something to eat, whatever measly portion or whatever stale potatoes or stale bread that they had, he'd lick his thumb and pick up the crumbs off the floor. Liam Tannum, he describes when they're walking around the exercise yard, I think it's in Wakefield, they look like tramps. Their clothes are soiled. They're all torn from they didn't have a change of clothes at all. And they're walking around the exercise yard, but luckily for him, he was sent a parcel from Ireland with some fruit in it or whatever. And he describes walking around the exercise yard. He's peeling an orange, he's eating the orange, and he's throwing the skins away. And the volunteers are diving on the orange skins and guzzling them, just shoving them into their gobs because they're so hungry. I think Stafford was a military prison. So while they were in there, they were listening to not so much British soldiers under torture, but they were certainly under punishment, and they weren't having a very nice time. Not a very nice atmosphere to be in. Frongok, again, endlessly fascinating stories, but very, very difficult conditions. Freezing cold, prisoners going on hunger strikes. You had, it's well documented at this stage then that they had, the whole University of Revolution aspect to it. It was a big, big mistake putting them in there. The British thought that it would be a good idea to put them up in North Wales, because apparently Wales has always had its kind of minor disagreements with England. And that area around Frongok was kind of regarded as a very, very secure loyalist sort of an area, but that didn't turn out to be the case, because a lot of the locals kind of took a shine to the volunteers. But you had very, very tough conditions. A lot of the English or Scottish who had fought with the Irish volunteers, they were trying to conscript them. So they were banded together, making sure that they weren't given any names, because they couldn't conscript them if they didn't know their names, if they only had English or Scottish accents. But that led to hunger strikes. You had an instance where there was the doctor in the camp. He killed himself because he ordered to refuse medical care to prisoners who were on hunger strike, and he had to grapple so much with his conscience, his Hippocratic oath, he ended up going and killed himself.
There was one story, though, that you had in the book that made me laugh an awful lot. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but remember you were telling me about them all demanding to be checked by the doctor for their sexual health, or...
this was great. I didn't remember that one.
You have to say that, but this is great.
Yeah. One of the things that they did was hundreds of prisoners, they gave them all a medical examination, and part of that examination was to see if they had venereal disease.
Yeah.
And when the doctor, this British doctor, came back absolutely astonished, he was like, hang on a second, like, none of these guys have venereal disease. What the hell is going on here? And one of the volunteers said to one of his officers or whatever, he says, this is shocking. He says, we can't be regarded as, any proper army should have at least sizable contingents of VD among its troops. We don't have any, therefore we don't constitute an army. Because at the time, 15% of British soldiers suffered venereal disease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Incredible.
But
Yeah, go on.
there's so many great stories. I mean, Seamus Grace, the pivotal fighter, of the Battle of Mount Street Bridge. I mean, the stuff he was getting up to over in Frongok. I mean, he wanted to go down and take over Frongok.
It was incredible. I want to ask you, though, one last question before you throw it up into the audience. Now, I know we didn't cover everyone's 1916 execution, but we're deliberately asking about Thomas Ashe next, if I can. Let's just see. Oh, yeah. How important was Thomas Ashe's death in 1917?
To me, it's the linchpin between the Rising and the War of Independence. So, it's often looked at as in, that there was round one, the Rising, and round two, the War of Independence. But I kind of look at it in a sense that it was like a phony war between the surrender in 1916 and when things kicked off again, in 1919, 1920. Because there was
What do you mean a phony war? What do you mean?
Well, it was all going on. There was all this sort of stuff going on in the background. Like the volunteers were, Cattle Brewer got them back together in October, November 1916. They were constituted as an organisation. Although a lot of people felt, that they would do things differently. But by the time Ashe died, it wasn't so much that they were an effective organisation, but they were starting to reform back into their companies and their battalions. So moves were being made. And Ashe was the head of the IRB at the time that he died. So he was seen as their chief. You'll often hear it said that De Valera was the only surviving commandant of the Rising. He wasn't. Ashe survived the Rising. Sean McLaughlin was a commandant. In fact, he was the commandant general, and he survived the Rising. But his death, the fact that he was on hunger strike, he was a massive persona, even to the point of, we describe it in the book as well, of how impressed the English soldiers were with Thomas Ashe. Again, one of these irrepressible sort of individuals that while he was on this, would have been a long, arduous train journey down to prison, he was cracking jokes and singing songs. I think he was singing songs about, the River Lee down in Cork or something. I think you're going to get the impression that the British soldiers thought he was a great guy. The Irish volunteers definitely thought he was a great guy. But when he was on the hunger strike, and then when he died from having been force-fed, if you look at the indignation that was felt from the executions, well, that's what you had again. And I remember looking at this and kind of wondering, was the outpouring of grief that's, was prevalent at Thomas Ashe's death, was this a sort of form of catharsis for the Irish people to mourn the executed leaders of 1916 that they never got a chance to do? For
a delayed reaction kind of way.
Well, an opportunity for the volunteers and for the public to kind of get out there and express their feelings through Ashe. His funeral was a monumental occasion. It was enormous. I mean, you can see the footage of it there on YouTube of what City Hall looked like and what the cortege looked like when it was being brought through town. But then when you're looking at, you have the people there in the PowerPoint there, you've got Richard Mulcahy. Now, he was in charge of the military unit that were up in Glasnevin Cemetery, firing the volleys of shots over his grave. Dick McKee was in charge of organising the funeral. You look at the footage of Michael Collins making the short, very, very rousing speech at Ashe's graveside. Look who these guys became.
Absolutely. And I mean, they became...
But one more point, and that's very, very important in the whole Ashe story. What took place the month after Ashe's funeral? The volunteer convention in 1917.
Yeah, it's a great point.
The volunteer, the national executive and the resident executives were formatted within a month of Ashe's death, and then it was business as usual again. Then they were going back. Although the War of Independence is described as kicking off in 1919, 1920, to me, it was going on the whole time. Okay.
Now, let's have a look at some of these questions and see if we're going to get shot ourselves for what we've been saying tonight.
I'll go get me blindfold.
Okay, so here we go. Daniel, Marcus, you forgot to mention those in Glasgow, Scotland is listening in. Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. Of course you're listening in. We're looking forward to your talk in Scotland that's coming up soon as well. Dominic Price, was there any debate about where the correct burial plot was in Arbor Hill, or was the site known from the beginning?
That's a good question that I don't actually have the answer to, Dominic. I would suggest that, I mean, the fact that it was at the back of a military prison, it was fairly close to where they were carrying out the executions. And I think it was quite possibly selected because it was a sort of an inconspicuous piece of ground that they could just put them in and it wouldn't become a shrine, which ultimately it did.
Paul Reed has said, thanks for this talk tonight, Derek and Marcus. I could listen all night. I'm wondering about Roger Casement's reaction on hearing of his comrades' executions. Are there any details you can share of his own execution in August? If you want, I can jump in, or you go ahead first, and I can jump in if you like.
One of the things, I don't want to talk about his execution, but one of the things that rang true when we were describing what was going on in Pentonville, before the last of the prisoners were sent home in June 1917, they were marshalled in Pentonville, god-awful prison that was apparently lice-infested, but on the way out, one of the things that struck them was it was engraved in a wall, RC 1916, as a tribute to Roger Casement. Yeah.
You also reckon that there's contention over whether or not it's his bones that was actually brought back or not. There's interesting points in terms of he actually wanted to be buried in, I think it was Murlock, is it Murlock Bay or Murlock Shore? But you know, he didn't want to be buried in Glasnevin. Like, that wasn't his aim. Like, you know, there's a lot. You could do a full documentary, you could do a full talk on Roger Casement and even the execution that was involved in that. Let's see, Conor Dullahan, do either of you know of the existence of Maxwell's diaries of the executions?
Darren would be the man to answer that one because I'm sure he does. I'm sure he's read them.
Okay. Anthony, hugely interesting. Derek mentioned that all were blindfolded before their execution. It's been reported that John McBride was allowed to leave his blindfold off. Is that true?
No. He asked and the soldier apologised but told him he had to. And the thing, McBride was, if anything, he was a soldier. You know, he'd led the Irish Transvaal Brigade and he understood soldiery, and he would have understood that the soldier who was ordered to put a blindfold on him had to obey his orders. McBride acquiesced. He died with a blindfold on.
Yeah. And also it was to help the British soldiers as well, like in terms of, I suppose, in terms of like, you know, the way like the shootings with Kant, I know the shootings went wrong with Kant anyway, but I mean, if somebody's looking at you directly in the eye when you're going to fire, you could be distracted by eye contact or movement or...
Yeah, but like I said earlier on, they did that because to prevent any sort of eye contact whatsoever. If you have somebody with, there was so many reasons for the blindfolds, you know, for the victim and also for those carrying out the executions. The eye contact would not be good for either.
Okay.
You make eye contact with somebody, it's a subjective connection that you have with them. That's not a good thing in a situation like that.
See what you mean, yeah. We've loads of questions coming in. Stephen Doyle, who always has a great question. Did the British determine the order of executions? Like, was Pearse always going to be the first man executed, or was the sequence based on the timing of the court-martials, or even the proclamation, or like, just to add to his question, like what determined the order of the executions?
I would say the court-martials. Pearse court-martial first, followed by McDonough, followed by if memory serves me right, followed by Tom Clarke.
Okay.
I would say it was just a matter of things just following the particular process.
Okay. Willie Barron, great lecture there, Derek. Had Captain Lee Wilson, who ill-treated Tom Clarke after the Rising and met us Waterloo and Gorey in 1920, any roles in the executions?
No.
No role. Okay.
No.
Joni Scanlon, who gave an excellent talk on Garota Sullivan the other day. Excellent talk. Do you have any insight on the reaction of prisoners in Richmond Barracks to the executions as were taking place? I've read that they could hear the shots and some of the guards taunted them.
It's an excellent question. They could hear the shots. It's only down the road, and you know, it's not just one shot. You know, you've 12 rifles going off, and on occasions you've got pistols going off as well. They could hear them. There's one aspect that you mentioned when you were launching the book, Marcus, was when they had the mock trial.
Yeah.
In barracks. They were very, very subdued at that stage. They knew what was going on, and the mood was very, very somber. You know, think of the situation where you've got this volunteer army. They're in defeat. They're thrown into this place where there's 60 of them put into a cell.
Yeah. My relation was one of them actually that was in the cell having them off.
Yeah, and you've got, you know, on the one hand, some of the soldiers were being exceptionally cruel at every available opportunity, as were the G-men who were there. Some of the other soldiers who were there were so horrified at the treatment that was being meted out to them that they went to great pains, sometimes even spending their own money to buy them bars of chocolate or cigarettes.
Yeah.
But ultimately, you had situations where you got 50 or 60 men in a cell. And in one particular case we documented where they have a bucket as a toilet, but these guys were all dying of thirst. And in this instance, to get the water, they removed the slop bucket, that's what they would have called it, brought the same bucket back in a couple of minutes later with water and said, there you go, there's your water, drink that. And it's just like, oh, this is...
I know, it's really humiliating kind of
stuff.
But
the point I'm making is that you've got this situation where they've had no sleep, filthy, ragged clothes, hungry, and then you've got, hundreds of their comrades have been taken away. They don't know to where at this point. They've just been marched out of Richmond Barracks. So there's uncertainty going on. Then the leaders are getting taken out and getting shot. So you've got this sort of, you would have a sense of depression being set in. However, you've also got officers and section commanders whose job, and they would have known it was their job, to make sure that they rally their men when they're at their darkest hours, which is what they did. But in one particular instance where we talk about that mock trial, this was just something that was done just to try and provide a distraction. And De Valera was involved, and Joseph Plunkett, his father, Count Plunkett, Joseph Plunkett was already dead at this point, and Count Plunkett was still a prisoner. But they carried out a court-martial, and they tried a prisoner of treason because he had laid claim to the throne of Muglins. If anybody doesn't know where...
This is very Harry Potter all of a sudden. What do you mean by that?
Muglins is Dalkey Island.
Okay.
This was something just to kind of lighten the load or whatever. But the problem was they found the guy guilty, and then they thought, well, the only thing we can do, we have to sentence you to death. And as they were sentencing him to death, albeit in a mock fashion, they found a black piece of rag to put on the judge in inverted commas head. But as they were doing that, a big sense of depression set in, and we have it documented in the book. I don't know who said it, but it was just like, Jesus, this is tough going, isn't
it? Lee Moog has said great lecture. Thank you. Nokia 7 Plus, which I'm sure is not their name, has said great lecture, lads. Dominic Price, absolutely riveting interview and discussion. Derek and Marcus could listen for hours. The research must have been incredible to witness. Thanks a million for this evening. Christina McMullen.
Thanks, Dominic. From you, that means a lot.
Yeah, great historian. His talk on Mayo was brilliant as well.
I heard it was great.
Christina McMullen, as always, I can sit and listen to you guys for hours. Fantastic work.
Thanks, sis.
Dermot Aylward, fantastic lecture. Marcus and Derek, thank you.
Thanks.
Huawei Y6 2019, excellent. Thank you, lads. You're very, very welcome. Thank you. And I don't want to make an Elon Musk joke there with the name, Johnny Doyle, great use of film following the funeral of Thomas Ashe by Lewis and Whitten to spread the news. Able to view in cinemas the same day as the funeral. Lee Moog, thank you. It was Murloc Bay about Roger Casement. Thank you. Neve Hassett, brilliant, lads. Thanks. Nokia, does Derek know anything about the escape? It's Dave Crooker. Does Derek know anything about the escape through the rotunda on the Saturday night?
No.
Okay. It has been mentioned. David has mentioned it before to me. We'll discuss it another time.
I'd be fascinated to hear about it.
Yeah. Brian Smith, fantastic. So glad I can join and learn about this. Here in America, holidays move around depending on if it's the last Friday of a month, etc. For the Easter Rising, is it celebrated, observed on a regular date, or does it move? That's a great question, Brian. We knew somebody called Tom Stokes who used to campaign that April the 24th should be seen as Republic Day. But because Easter's like a holy holiday, it often changes. And so sometimes you even end up like remembering Easter twice as a result of it. Eamon Carpenter, thanks for your time. Peter Brannigan, thanks for the talk. Folks, very interesting stuff. Johnny Doyle, any difference in the execution of Thomas Kent, who was shot down in Cork?
Yes, subtle differences. Nothing, I mean, a similar sort of a thing. If I remember rightly, I think Kent was shot in a chair. But there was nothing particularly noteworthy about it. And I mean, we didn't pay too much attention to it because we were concentrating on Dublin. He was offered, I think they offered him brandy or something like that, and he refused. He did. there was some other very interesting things about Kent. I think they offered him what they would have called a splendid last meal. That would have been a lot better than the normal rations that they would have given to the prisoners, because apparently he was an educated man. He wasn't just a commoner. But no, the actual execution itself was it went according to plan as far as they were concerned, as far as his executioners were concerned.
Okay, Kieran McMullen, exceptional job. Derek and Marcus, thank you. Christina, love you. Derek, Sister Lisa, John Connolly, brilliant lecture. Intensity and level of detail is brilliant. Trish Boyle, thank you for this, really interesting. Audra Spicer, I'm only sorry I came late. I was off the mark late. It will be uploaded to YouTube very soon, Audra, don't worry. Chris Cummins, great talk. Derek, you have the skill of a true storyteller. You listen to your words and are transported back in time. You should see what it's like when you're drinking with him. Audra Spicer, please post a recording. Thank you. Phil Cahill, great stuff, guys. Aidan Fitz, thanks very much for a great lecture. My 11-year-old daughter and I are sitting here really enjoying it. Well, hello Brilliant. To Aidan and your 11-year-old daughter. Kathleen Cleary, who's been so good to us. Thanks, Marcus and Derek, for a great lecture. Amy Kenny, excellent, well done. Could listen to you for hours. Eamon Carpenter, most enjoyable. Angela Clancy, to everyone. Really enjoyed this talk. So interesting. First time joining. You're very welcome, Angela. I would like to say this, just your book is Those of Us Who Must Die, which is here. And it is an exceptional book. I have launched his book with Darren because my relation was in Richmond Barracks at the time of 1916 executions. Now he was released.
Oh yeah, we've got to show the products.
You have to show the products, you know. Remember, this is on video, okay? So, I just want to say, next time if there's a 1916 debate on Facebook, you know, and you just don't want to go through the same old arguments, maybe just share the link, and you know, we'll definitely help settle some arguments. Johnny Doyle, the two best books on Lisa Rising, I 100% agree with that. They are. Just if you'd like to, maybe if we could just unmute everybody, give a round of applause if that's all right. So Derek, can we do that? So from around the world, well done. And we'd just like to say we have a absolutely massive talk happening on Saturday. Derek will be back along with Liz Gillis, Cormac O'Malley, numerous historians from Saturday to Burning of the Barracks.
I'm sure I'll probably find
thank you so much, guys, and we'll see you again.
At the end of this month.
Thanks very much.
Marcus, thanks, Derek.
Thank you.
She was in good form now, in fairness. Do you know, she's like, what can, like, just like everything.